Welcome to August's Ballotpedia Insights. Our Insights is a Q&A series with political and legal scholars, researchers, reporters, and subject matter experts. In each installment, as if you've been with us for a while, you know, we will host a new speaker and ask them tailored questions designed to gain in-depth insight into their work. And today I'm really excited to have with us Adam Probolsky, who is one of Ballotpedia's main supporters and a good friend of ours who also will just lend a very interesting lens to this 2020 election cycle and the idea of research and polling. So let me give you a brief background on Adam, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome, Adam. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Sarah.
All right. So Mr. Probolsky is the president of Probolsky Research, which is a full-service opinion research firm specializing in market research and opinion research on elections and public policy, working on behalf of business, government, nonprofit, special interests, and media clients. He has acted as a pollster and strategic advisor on hundreds of successful crisis communications and public affairs projects, local, county, and statewide initiatives, which are, as you guys know, near and dear to Ballotpedia's heart, and public and candidate campaigns, as well as citizen outreach and education efforts. Additionally, Adam has been a key advisor to the firm's clients on matters of public policy, legislation, and business strategy. So we're gonna hop right in today. We've had many user-submitted questions just dealing with this topic, but first we're going to start with a more general, broad question, which is, please tell us what Probolsky Research is, what you do, what your specialties are.
Thanks, Sarah. So we are market and opinion researchers. Our job is to help oftentimes government clients, so cities, counties, special districts, state governments, understand their communities, understand voters or residents, and hopefully improve their customer service or accomplish a goal. Oftentimes, a government agency is looking to build a big project, and you have to do outreach when you're doing that to make sure you're communicating in the right way, communicating in the way people want to be communicated with. Or you're trying to pass a tax, let's say, perhaps, and you want to make sure you're talking to them in the language and the message that they want. So our research is the work that's done at the beginning of that process, and then feeds into what the PR consultant, the outreach staff person does, the media people do, the lobbyists perhaps, and they use that data to do the outreach and the advocacy. Same thing for corporate clients or nonprofits. They have typically an agenda. They want to build something. They want to get legislation passed, and so our job is to help them understand what the public thinks. Oftentimes, demonstrating public support, broad-based public support, in the face of kind of that vocal minority that oftentimes drives the agenda. So our job is to kind of show that more global support that's out there, or apathy, quite frankly, the fact that most people just don't care. And then, of course, we do some pure politics, and that everybody understands. The mayor's running for re-election. How does he message? The candidate running for U.S. Senate, and how does she communicate what she needs to communicate, and kind of align her philosophy with the voters and making sure she pulls the things that she cares about and talks about that with the way the voters care about it.
So it's almost just like taking the pulse of whatever community or group or broad swath of people the company or the campaign is trying to really gauge what their opinion is. Is that a fair way to summarize it?
I think it's a great way to summarize it. There's the one difference I would say is taking the pulse is one thing. It's kind of like what we see the snapshot polls, who's leading in the horse race for president. That's a great piece of information, and it makes some candidates sleep better at night, and some worry about, am I going to be able to survive the next week in a campaign? But more importantly, it's the strategic use of the data. Mm-hmm. So understanding, even just the horse race, there's strategy there that says, okay, I'm down among college-educated women with high incomes in Western states. How do I change the narrative so we're talking to them in a better way versus some other or testing? Okay, it was just discovered that I said something crazy about some policy area 25 years ago, is that going to affect me in a broad level, other than the media just talking about it incessantly for days at a time, or am I going to weather this just fine and I can just kind of ignore it?
Yeah, very interesting. So I think the reason we got a lot of engagement with you as a guest coming on is because polling has been such a big topic since the 2016 elections. It reemerged in 2018, and I'm sure it'll still be a very, very hot topic in 2020. So one reader asked, after the 2016 election, we heard a lot about how polling was broken. Do you agree with that narrative? And has anything changed in the industry since then?
Well, sure, absolutely. Things have changed. I don't think polling is broken, of course. And I'd be the first to admit that there are changes needed and things that didn't go right. And we have all the tools to make sure that doesn't happen again. So here's a couple things that happened. First of all, national polls were absolutely 100% or 99% dead on. National polls showed Hillary winning. Hillary won the popular vote. Case over, great, everybody was right. Where they go wrong is, first of all, people were mostly listening to the national polls when they should have been listening, quite frankly, to the state-by-state polls, which is how we elect presidents in the United States. No other election happens like that. Governors aren't elected on a county-by-county basis. They're elected by popular vote, so we don't really think about it that often. But the popular vote was right. And so were there nuances of state polls that got it wrong? Of course, but there weren't that many. So that's, I think, the biggest challenge, is that there weren't that many state polls that were being really reported on. Also, the answer is, of course, things change. We innovate as researchers literally every day. There's nothing we did yesterday that we don't question today. And that's the way you make sure you get things right. So, for instance, multi-mode doing surveys on landlines and cell phones, of course, and then online as well, has been kind of the rule for the last 4 to 6 years. But really, after 2016, became okay, there's no way we can't do this. And here's the reason. There's oftentimes where, and I say oftentimes, within a survey where the responses will be different for telephone responses and online responses. And that is both extremely scary and extremely exciting for us as researchers, because we then identify that maybe people are a little bit more uncomfortable telling our interviewers something that they're saying differently on an online environment, where they realize it's not just anonymous, because all surveys are anonymous, but much more anonymous, right? They don't even have to say their feelings to someone.
Right.
And when that happens, then that's our job to do further discovery and say, okay, this person says everything's great in the country, or people say, let's say, everything's great to our interviewers, but 3% or 5% of people are saying that it's less great in their online responses. So we now know there may be a little challenge here. There may be people who are less comfortable saying that they're not happy with the direction of the country, but online they're willing to say it. And there's a ton of examples of that. And that's great. That's how we figure out that there's a more challenge on our hands, and that we have to do some more discovery work. So that's how we're solving the problem of making sure that we don't have another 2016.
Yeah, it's fascinating that you brought up the idea of state-by-state polling and how that played into the narrative around the polling in 2016, because even in 2018, we were hearing all about this U.S. House popular vote idea the morning after the election, and I'm going, what? There's no, come on, guys. Civics 101. It's really hard to interpret that kind of polling. And it's great. It's interesting to have that type of polling, but if you're not interpreting it correctly, or you're kind of listening to this broad media narrative about polling, it can get really muddied and confusing very quickly.
Yeah, it's media coverage is, well, we'll see later. We did some research on it. Media coverage is great. Obviously, as pollsters, we love when they cover our polls, but we also hope that they kind of get it right and they have us on to kind of explain them.
Right. Yeah. So that's a good segue. You're talking about the difference between the online and the telephone methods. I had a few questions from readers and our own staff about that. So I'll give you a few parts of this. With the demise of landlines, does your company use cell phones to contact people? And then can you get a little bit into the other types of polling? So just either focus groups or email, just kind of your methods there. You touched on it just now. But then also, has the emergence of mobile phones and almost just the depletion of landlines, has that affected your polling process?
So it's absolutely changed the way we do business, but it has absolutely increased our accuracy and made it easier to poll, which is maybe counterintuitive. So first off, when we do a typical poll in any political subdivision, the state of Nevada or the county of Los Angeles or Miami, city of Miami Beach, our typical scenario is to call people on their landlines, on their cell phones, and email them in order to get them to respond online. We're now also doing texting. So you get a text, you click through, and you can complete the survey online, just the same way you can do for getting an email. You just kind of click through. And we're essentially, our job is to meet respondents, whether it's voters or residents or members of an organization. Our job is to meet them where they are and give them a comfortable place to respond. So some people, it turns out, in America are still using their landlines. They answer that landline, they talk to our interviewers, and they complete the survey. The same thing goes for cell phone. The great advantage of cell phone and online is 25 years ago or 30 years ago, the only way I could contact you is on your home phone at dinner time. And that's really, was really annoying. And it was very restrictive for pollsters because that was a very limited amount of time and place where we can contact people. Now we get to call you on your cell phone when you're driving to work, when you're walking your dog, when you're even preparing dinner. You can talk to us on your speakerphone.
Oh, joy.
As long as you're in a safe place, you can absolutely respond to us. And then the same thing goes, online. Grandma is on Facebook. She clicks over to her Gmail at 10 o'clock at night, and she sees an email about a local survey or whatever the survey is. She clicks through and she starts completing a survey. So and the same thing goes for the millennial who's on their cell phone, at their lunch hour, gets a text and clicks through. So we get to reach you in all different dates and times and places, and give us that greater level of accuracy because we're not just calling landlines. There's a nuance that you hear all the time by lazy reporters that it's harder because you can't call cell phones or it's more expensive to call cell phones. And the answer is it's true. And not to get too much into the weeds, but the FCC says on landlines, you can call using a dialer system. So typically when you get a call from any kind of organization other than your doctor's office, it's a dialer calling, and they're calling 3 numbers at a time. And when you pick up the phone, the computer hears, the interviewer hears low, part of hello, because it gives that call to the interviewer, and the other 2 calls drop off. That's why you get drop-off calls pretty often on landlines if you ever answer one anymore. So that dialer system makes it very efficient for interviewers to be calling and contacting people, rapid fire. You can't use that technology with cell phones. The FCC says you have to dial 1-to-1. So it's less efficient, meaning it costs more to call cell phones, but the fact that we can talk to people at all different times of day in the evening means the efficiency gap is clearly made up very easily. So bottom line, there's all those different ways of doing the research and getting people on the phone or to respond online. Going to the point about focus groups and other kind of research, we love as researchers qualitative research, which is what we call it. We don't always get to do it because not everybody has the budget for it. But in the perfect research scenario, you get to do that qualitative research where you sit in a group of people, whether 12 people around a table or 5 people around a table, or sometimes it's done online 1-to-1. There's all different kinds of ways of doing it. The goal in those environments is to really understand the way people talk about subject matter. So we're I mean, let's call ourselves subject matter experts on elections. So we have some really unique language that we use when we talk about electoral college or election days or types of voters, absentee voters or vote by mail voters, things like that, or certainly policy things like we might talk about immigration or interest rates differently than other people. So our job in that qualitative is to say, okay, how do you talk about it? What are the words that you use? So then from a marketing standpoint or from a campaign standpoint, how does that company or organization or campaign talk back to the voters or to the residents or their market in a way that kind of connects with them rather than just words that we think work?
Can you give some specific examples of where a company may be talking about a term one way, but it just, with a focus group, you learn that another term was much more, resonated much better with them?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's take a toll road or toll road agency, for instance, that has very specific names for the different kinds of customers they have. These cash customers versus customers that pay with a tag thing that automatically hits when they go through the toll road. The organization spends millions of dollars to communicate what they call each of these customers, the categories, cash customer versus automatic customer, whatever the name might be. And when you talk to the customer and you say, tell me what you think a cash customer is, tell me what you think an automatic customer is, and they're kind of blank faces. And they've literally spent millions of dollars to communicate that you are a cash customer. They put it red in the bill. But at the end of the day, if they don't relate to them, if they don't think they're a cash customer and that didn't mean anything to them, then it doesn't matter. You've got to start talking their language or step up your game when it comes to what your marketing is and how you talk to people. So that's just one public agency example. We can't really offer too many corporate private client ones, but that's a public agency one.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah, it's interesting. Even the signs, thinking about the signs when you're driving through tolls, probably all the market research that goes into saying, here's the easy pass lane versus the cash lane. You don't even think about that on a day-to-day basis when you're going along, but I'm sure that was millions of dollars in market research right there.
Yes.
So one just general question that came in was, what are the ethical standards that pollsters and market researchers adhere to?
So not many, and I think that may be exactly what people think is the case. But there's certain communication rules as far as how we reach out to people. The FCC prescribes. But other than that, there's one that is essentially sacred, and that is our respondents are essentially confidential. So your information, your responses are aggregated and pulled together along with your demographic data, so age and gender and party and geography and all those different things, but never revealing the individual. And that's really critical for us as pollsters because we need people to have confidence and comfort that that we're not going to reveal their information personally. And other than that, there's reporting. There's an organization called American Association of Public Opinion Research and some others that we subscribe to, generally this idea that we want our data to be trusted. So we tell people when we conducted the research, among what group, among population we conducted the research, what the margin of error that we calculate, and other data points about the research that give people confidence that the data is accurate. So that's a key part, and there's no law that requires that. But if you see a poll that says doesn't include that kind of information, you just start to question the validity of it. Why don't they want me to know this? Why isn't there a place that I can click through and see a report from the pollster that gives me all the information and background about the methodology and the data itself?
And to the first code of ethics, the assumed one about the anonymity. So that would be something like, for me, it would be, I'm aggregated as a 25 to 34-year-old female living in Maryland, but nobody would know that this 25 to 34-year-old or any distinguishing factor was the one saying, no, I do not want to be called a cash customer. Is that kind of the gist of that?
Yeah, our job is to make sure no one could ever identify you as the respondent.
Okay.
So just to give a further illustration, we'll even, let's say, plot on a map where respondents were and show, let's say, a red or a green dot that they support the candidate or oppose the candidate, or they want to buy this toothpaste or they don't want to buy this toothpaste. That red dot, we go to pains to make sure is not on the street level and where it's identifiable to figure out who you are. It's on a grander level, a neighborhood level, so it's harder to discern. There would be no way of discerning which of the 5,000 houses in that neighborhood actually responded.
Okay, great, because I do not want Colgate knocking on my door that I don't like their toothpaste. So
right, they would be very mad, very mad.
That sounds good to me. Okay, so here's one that's pretty elections related. How do you assess a random poll's accuracy? For instance, if a poll might be skewed by calling or reaching out to a heavily Republican area with questions maybe related to a Democratic candidate or a Democratic incumbent, how do you select the people that are going to be participating in the poll? And do you have accommodations for when you have to poll in a heavy, for example, Republican area about a Democratic issue?
So if we're polling in, let's say, a particular county that's heavily Republican or Democratic, we disclose where we're polling, and people generally know what that, or may or may not know what the demographic makeup is, the party makeup is. So I think the key is transparency. You're polling in this political subdivision, this geography, and this is what people think. I don't think that there's any problem with revealing those results, as long as people understand that's where the data came from and that's what people think there. But keep in mind, our job is to get a representative sample. So let's say we're polling in the state of Connecticut. Our job is to make sure we get the right number of men and women, the right number of people in each age group, and that depends, right? If we're talking to residents, it's a much different scenario than it is if we're talking to voters, because there's a big chunk of people who aren't necessarily voters. So depending on the universe we're talking to, and the data should typically show, any pollster is going to demonstrate, these are the percentage of men and women, these are the percentage of people in each party, of people in each township or grouping of townships or counties. And so all of a sudden you can easily identify, wait a second, well, usually the media would look at it and say, wait a second, they've got too many Republicans in that poll. That is not going to be representative of the sample. And the pollster should have the chance to say, hey, guess what? We believe this is what the turnout model looks like, and it's going to be heavier Republican. Here's our logic behind it, why we think that, and that's why we use polling data. This polling data is valid. Or if the pollster you can look at it and say that's just a bunch of baloney, that number of Republicans isn't going to show up, and you can make that argument. But you should always know what the demographic breakdown of the results are, and you can then, as a reporter or as an individual, if you know the demographics, just go to the Census Bureau and say, okay, this is way off, or go to the voter registration rolls and say, this is way off. And if it's not defensible, then you can just kind of toss that poll out.
Yeah, that's interesting. So just as a reminder, if anybody listening does have questions, please feel free to drop them into the Zoom chat or in the Facebook comments. But just related to that, so in an ideal world, pollsters would have all this data figured out, the modeling, they'd have the backup to what they're doing and why. And also in an ideal world, the media would be able to interpret it correctly and also act as a check to what the poll is saying. But how do we, in the general public who don't have this background, and I remember when I was working in editorial for Ballotpedia and having to compile polls, I mean, yeah, I get what a margin of error is, I get what sample size is, but after that, when you get further down in the studies, your eyes kind of glaze over. So how, for us as the public, can we assess a poll's validity? So accuracy, bias, breadth. Is there a way for us as laymen to research the data behind the headlines and kind of get beyond the cable punditry?
There's two organizations that well, three, I guess. So APOR, I mentioned earlier. Also, Huffington Post and AP have very prescribed details of what they accept as polls, and there's like 20 different things they look for before they accept a poll as valid. You can Google it and find APs or Huffington Post or APORs, and it's a very detailed, okay, you have to disclose who the poll was being conducted on behalf of. You have to disclose the number of respondents, the margin of error, disclose the total number of questions, even if you're not revealing all the questions, the question order, a lot of other details, which I think most pollsters generally subscribe to most of those things. There may be some parts of those details that are left out, but if people are generally transparent about the data, if you see a memo that's 1 page or even 5 pages, I don't care, and there's no methodology, it doesn't say like, okay, this is the responses from informed voters after we told them 100 things about both candidates, or something like that, and it's just a one-line methodology that just says it was conducted last week, then you can start to question it. But I think you can also obviously Google or search the pollster themselves and say, okay, what's have they been reported on in the New York Times, the LA Times, on Fox News, on CNN over the course of the last decade? Okay, they're probably in business to be in business and not to be a shill for somebody. And not to try to discredit themselves by putting out something that isn't accurate. So I think that's probably how I would do it if I was, and that's quite frankly how I do it. If I see a poll from someone I've never heard of, I search for them, see, okay, do they have a website that's had a post or something updated in the last 6 months? Do they have a news story that was written about them in the last 6 weeks? And do they have a pretty transparent level of methodology that makes me feel like, okay, they did this. Now, I will be careful to say, we release results oftentimes for clients that we reveal for that's who we conducted it for, and those are results that a lot of people don't necessarily like. They don't like the answer to the question. And so if you don't like the answer to the question the pollster is giving you, you shouldn't assail necessarily the pollster. You can certainly pick apart their data and look for ways of why it might not be accurate. But don't assume that they're somehow, taking money and making up numbers and putting it out to the public. Assume that they're trying to do their job and that, they may be revealing certain parts of data. So for instance, if we put a memo out that says, a brand is well-liked, and people think, well, that's a bunch of baloney, it's not true, people don't like them at all. Read that a little bit more and you may discover that that brand is well-liked among a certain demographic. And that's the message we're trying to communicate. But we're not trying to pull one over on anybody. We're just trying to communicate a certain message that we hope the media picks up on, or that brand can kind of talk about and use in their communications. So you got to look at the nuance. It's very rare that there's an organization that calls themselves a research organization or a pollster that is literally out there just making stuff up. It doesn't ordinarily happen, and when it does, they get called out for it, and they're gone in a minute and a half.
Yeah, interesting, especially with the corporate polling. I mean, I can't imagine many market researchers who are independent of the corporation have much skin in the game
Right.
in terms of the results. So that's very helpful. So this question strikes me deep to the core. So why do people complete surveys online or talk with interviewers? And do you find that there is a type of person? So I will say all of Ballotpedia's employees are remote. So do you feel like there's a person like me who, when I get a phone call, I don't care if I don't know the number, I will absolutely answer it and talk to whoever will talk to me. So do you find that there is a certain type of person who responds, and does that ever bring in an inherent bias to doing telephone versus online? And I know we touched on it earlier, but is there a type of person who will sit there and talk to somebody calling them cold out of the blue?
I'm interested in the subject matter. I think it's my responsibility to communicate, how I feel. I'm bored. Those are some good reasons why people respond.
I've only talked to my dog today.
Right. So for sure, it's easier for us to get responses from seniors. It's easier for us to get responses from people in the kind of that mid-income socioeconomic level, because people who are in the lower socioeconomic are typically working more aggressive schedule, and people in the higher socioeconomic strata are just less interested in spending their time talking to us. So there are certain groups that are maybe organically easier to reach, but it's our job. And that's why we love the fact that we have phone and landline, cell phone, text, email, all these different possibilities of reaching you. It's our job to kind of get beyond that potential inherent bias. And so we just had a conversation with a public agency today, and because we don't tend to weight our results nationally, you sometimes have to, but on a political subdivision by political subdivision, state or county basis, there's no reason to weight results, which basically means you're kind of cooking the books to kind of say, okay, we don't have enough women, so we're going to amplify the results of the women we have to suggest that's the answer that they would give if we talk to more women. The fact is, we can keep calling people until we get that, doctor who makes $200,000 a year, who's African-American and lives, at the coast, versus the fact that we've also got to figure out how to get those 6 other women who are 35 to 44 who have kids and own a home, and they're really hard to reach. But we got to keep calling, keep emailing, keep texting until we get that last one. And so it's the biggest challenge of our job is to accurately reflect the demographics that we're trying to get, whether that's voters or residents or people who care about a certain product. And that's absolutely the hardest part of what we do, but it's what we have to do to overcome any of those biases of just getting senior citizens who answer their phone and talk to whoever it calls them.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. So one last kind of wrap-up question, and then Adam had a few things to show us, including some recent interesting findings. So just to kind of pull this all together, do you find that polling is harder today than it was maybe 10 or 20 years ago? And if so, why? And really, if not, why?
Yeah, I don't think so at all. In fact, I think it's a lot easier. And we kind of talked about those things. The fact that we have all those different tools for communicating, for reaching out. There's even, the possibility, and we've used it in the past, of using social media to attract respondents, certainly to attract people for focus groups and other qualitative research. And even today, we're developing technology for Alexa and Google Home and products like that, where we can do market research and opinion research on those new technology platforms.
Wow.
And in a way, it's easy for people to do. They can even earn some points and credits for doing it, and you get them to interact with you on a daily basis. So technology has kind of opened up the floodgates to market and opinion research and makes our lives as researchers like a ton easier.
Wow. Anybody who's listening, I'd love to hear from you after this, how you feel about that kind of stuff, because it's very interesting, and I have a feeling this will strike either a great chord, or I'd love to sit there and talk to Alexa all day about my thoughts and opinions. So so this is exciting. All right, well, Adam, I know you have a few things you'd like to show us, and Kayla, if you could share that presentation, and we'll walk through those.
Sure. So here we just pulled together this idea. I know we're talking interchangeably sometimes about market research and opinion research. And the truth is there are clear differences. Market research talks to consumers. and opinion research typically oftentimes talks to voters. There's a real clear delineating line where opinion research and talking to voters, you have the opportunity in most places, most states, to use the voter file, where there is a voter file, and gives a lot of data, a lot of metrics about individuals, their age, their gender, their party, sometimes where it's categorized, and where they live, things like that. That voter file is only available when you're talking about public policy, and in most cases really just about elections. Market researchers cannot, by law, use that data. And if they do, it's a big penalty, it's a consequence. So market researchers have typically had to use a lot of different types of ways of getting into your household, getting into your mind, and try to understand what you're thinking. And here we kind of show the role of market research and the role of opinion research. And if we kind of go to the next little click, you kind of see that we call them confusable today because they're really starting to meld together. Other than that, so some of those clear legal lines. Other than that, the techniques for campaigning are being adopted by marketers, and the techniques for marketing are being adopted by campaigns. So the role of market and opinion research are kind of melding, just as marketing and campaigning are melding, and so our best word is confusable, and you're going to see that happen more and more as the techniques kind of come together and people start using them interchangeably. I'd love to show you some new data we just came up with, national survey work. So let's go to the first one. Here we ask a question. This is a little bit self-effacing. When you see a news story about a presidential poll, do you ignore it or do you read or watch it? And it turns out that this is not among voters. This is among U.S. adults nationally. 84% they just ignore it. And I don't doubt that data. It's just not that interesting to the broader public broadly. There's about 16% that say, I want to know about that. Among voters, that number would probably be a whole lot higher. But that's okay. You don't have to be a news insider to be an American, right? And so it's just kind of interesting that, okay, 84% of the public just doesn't care what we have to say when it comes to presidential polling anyway.
Well, and we're still so far out with 26 candidates or whatever. Oh my gosh. Even as a Ballotpedia staffer, I'm like, oh, I don't know if I want to see another presidential poll right now.
It's true. It's true. Okay, so let's go to the next one, and we'll take a look at what people think about money in politics. And this is something I think everybody has been talking about as far as the media goes. And I think there's a real concern that there's money corrupting politics. So we gave two statements, and we asked people which they agree with more. Money has corrupted politics. It's broken. 84% agree with that statement. And then there's the reality that money and politics go together and it's fine. 16% agree with that statement. And I think I would probably subscribe more to the, hey, it's fine, just because this is the way it's been forever. And the fact is that we have the First Amendment, and it's really hard to change things like that say that money is always going to be in politics. But that doesn't matter necessarily what I think, because if 84% are in the it's broken category, something ought to be done before it comes to a boiling point, and maybe it already has come to that point. So if you're a policymaker who says, look, First Amendment says anybody can give anything they want, and we should just kind of move on because you can't change it, well, you're maybe right. But you ought to do something to address the 84% who think that there's a major problem. And even if it's incremental changes or incremental improvements to the system, you ought to probably do that, because you're really kind of ignoring the people that think it's a problem. Or you got to spend a lot of resources to figure out how to convince those 84% that it's not a problem. So it's a problem, though.
So the one thing that stands out to me there is the idea of right now, feels kind of on both sides, the populist movement is coalescing around this idea of broken, it needs to be fixed. And so I wonder how much, if I were taking a poll and I was part of that kind of group of everything in politics right now is broken, if just even that insertion of it's broken versus it's fine, if that can sway people one way or another in responding.
I love it. Sarah, you could be a pollster. You just identified some potential biasing information. And here's the cool part about this question. Our goal in questions like this oftentimes is to push people essentially into a box. There's 5 more potential variants of this question and different statements we could have given to kind of identify really where people are on the spectrum of this issue. But our goal here was to really push you as far as we could with a pretty charged statements, 2 pretty charged statements, and see where you fell. And sometimes that's our job, is to really kind of speak to the heart of your emotion and see, which place you run to. So we really truly understand that baseline understanding. We would, in a campaign or any kind of market research work, we would kind of work on some nuances from here. But here we really got that visceral reaction, and that's what we were looking for.
Fascinating. Yeah, Rosier Research will be coming in 2020. No,
Yeah.
Watch out. Fascinating. Great.
All right. And then next up, we did something that I loved. So this is, which of these social media apps or websites do you use most regularly? So this doesn't mean they only use this one. People could use multiple. But I wanted to really drive which is your home base when it comes to social media. And and again, this is among U.S. adults. So 46% say they don't use any of them regularly, and we didn't define regularly. So regularly to me probably means every 4 hours. Regularly to someone else can mean once a day, and or whatever that number is. So we didn't define it, and so that keep that in mind. But Facebook is clearly home base for most U.S. adults. Instagram, following, and keep in mind, right, different demographics. If we ask this among 18 to 35-year-olds, Instagram would probably shoot up significantly. I love here that Twitter is where it's at. Not that more people don't use Twitter, that's just not their home base when it comes to social media, but it's also just not that big. We find this all over the place, that the media promotes tweets from all kinds of people, but for the most part, even in any particular political subdivision where it's among voters, Twitter is like a half or a third or even less than Facebook is in most places. Nextdoor is one that fewer people are familiar with, but it's a really important place where a lot of conversations happen. But it's, again, not the home base for a lot of people. And then you can kind of see, down there, TikTok at the end. Obviously we didn't survey any, 14 to 17, so it just didn't come up that much. But it's kind of cool to kind of get a sense of, okay, this is what the landscape looks like among U.S. adults and what they focus on. And it may be different than what I think the media thinks.
I mean, this was the most fascinating slide to me because of exactly what you just said, the Twitter answer. That's all we hear about every day. We're hearing about AOC tweets or Trump tweets. And I was just on the phone with the campaign manager last week who was saying how his candidates want these Twitter presences, and they think that's the most important thing. And he's going, no, you still got to knock on some doors. And I mean, this research just lends itself perfectly to that. I mean, Twitter is viewed as this huge phenomenon, but stick to Facebook maybe.
Well, look, there's no, the numbers vary obviously by location and geography and things like that, and demographics of who you're trying to reach. So if you're really trying to reach a younger demographic, you're going to do your own research in your own area, and you're going to identify where to talk to them at. So you're never going to write off any of these platforms necessarily. But yeah, I mean, Twitter, I think the reason why we hear so much about Twitter is it's an easy platform to put your message out. It's an easy place for media or anyone else to go find it, pick it up, and use it. And so that's really what Twitter is about. Is any of these places is the ease of posting. Campaigns used to put out press releases and hope that a newspaper picked it up, whereas now you can put out your message in a very succinct format, and anyone can go see it. I think that's the value of it, more than necessarily throngs of your voters or your customers, taking out your information and reading it.
Well, this was fascinating, and was that the last slide, I think, right?
Yeah, it was the last slide, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Adam. And if you would like to be informed of any upcoming Ballotpedia insights, please head to ballotpedia.org. And on our homepage, you'll find a way to sign up for our updates, our daily brew email, our weekly tap, and then even issues like donor disclosure, which we were talking about campaign finance earlier. We have monthly and weekly specialized email updates there. But thank you so much to Adam and Probolsky Research, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Sarah.